You rely on this podcast to stay informed and connected with your local community, and we rely on you. Without listener support, this show simply wouldn't exist. Be a part of the team that makes this show possible by donating to our home, KUOW. It only takes a minute. Donate at KUOW.org or follow the link in the show notes. And thank you.
You're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Denkman. Public opinion polling. It's never been more consequential for the direction of our democracy or more scrutinized. For weeks, journalists, pundits, and politicians have debated the available data on the outcomes of a head-to-head rematch between President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump. Those numbers had appeared increasingly troubling for Democrats, and the polling data in the end reportedly made the difference for President Biden in deciding to step aside. W. Joseph Campbell is a professor emeritus of communications at American University, and he's the author of Lost in a Gallup, Polling Failures in U.S. Presidential Elections. And he's here with me now. Hi, Joe. Thank you very much for being here.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
So what is your take on how polls have been discussed and debated over the last few weeks in this presidential race?
They really have had a centerpiece, haven't they, in the political discussion over the past several weeks. And it's been pretty clear that Donald Trump was opening a gradual but pretty clear lead over Joe Biden over the last 3.5 weeks, since the disastrous debate that Joe Biden had with Trump at the end of June. Biden's data, polling data, were not crashing or cratering, but they were clearly showing an expansion of Trump's lead, and I think that ultimately had a major factor. It was a major factor in his deciding to bow out. That decision was an inevitable decision, in my view, but and perhaps it's 3.5 weeks overdue, but nonetheless, polling really had a major role, I think, in his taking that decision finally.
And what do you think, which data was the deciding factor? I mean, we talked about the fact that Nancy Pelosi, a longtime ally of Biden, had brought swing state numbers, in front of him. Peter Baker at the New York Times had reported that Biden had been trailing Trump by 5 points in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, the blue wall states, 6 points in Nevada, 7 points in Arizona, and 8 points in Georgia. For you, is it really those swing state numbers that stood out the most and probably made the decision, as you say, inevitable?
They could have. They could have been a real major contributing factor. However, polling is so ubiquitous, and there's so many polls that are being conducted on almost a daily basis that you can cherry-pick numbers if you want to. You can cherry-pick polling results that look more favorable for your candidacy or not. And I think Joe Biden was inclined to do that up until almost the very end, saying that there were some polls out there that were showing that he had a chance, that he had a lead over Donald Trump. And there weren't too many of those, but there were a few. The Marist PBS poll, for example, I think had Biden up by 2 points last week. And so you can find supporting evidence in even dire polling data. But I agree with you that the polling data was becoming more and more dramatic in Trump's favor, and that had to have had a major impact and a factor in Biden's decision.
Until Sunday, President Biden had, as you say, been using examples of the few select polls that showed him ahead nationally. He also said, does anybody really believe that polls are accurate these days? And I know that reflects a lot of skepticism that people have felt since 2016 and the election of President Donald Trump, which I think for people who, for example, had been addicted to the 538 polling tracker was a huge surprise. So I guess my question to you is, are polls accurate these days?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. And Trump has been saying the same thing about polls, that you just can't believe them. I guess he's saying that less often now that he tends to have a slight but clear lead in the polls. But polling is going through a rough patch. There's no doubt about it, particularly in presidential elections, starting maybe in 2012 when Barack Obama won re-election in an election that was not as close as pollsters had figured. In fact, the most venerable of all pollsters, the Gallup organization, had Mitt Romney, Obama's opponent in 2012, ahead narrowly at the end of the campaign. So polling didn't distinguish itself in 2012. It certainly did not distinguish itself in 2016, although for different reasons. Key state polls in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania tended to indicate that Hillary Clinton had, as you mentioned a moment ago, a blue wall of protection for her candidacy. And Trump won each of those three states narrowly, but surprisingly. And the polls didn't allow a whole lot of anticipation, or didn't give us a whole lot of early warning that those states were in jeopardy for Hillary Clinton. And then in 2020, a number of pollsters thought that Joe Biden was going to cruise to victory in a rout, in a landslide of 10 percentage points or greater. We haven't seen a landslide in a presidential election in this country since 1984, when Ronald Reagan defeated Walter Mondale by 18 points. And the polls in 2020 were signaling that Joe Biden had a more comfortable margin than it turned out to be. He won the election in 2020 by 4.5 percentage points, which is a clear victory, but far from the landslide, far from the rout that some pollsters, such as CNN, Quinnipiac University, NBC News, Wall Street Journal, ABC News, Washington Post were thinking that he was destined for an easy and overwhelming victory.
Yeah.
So polling has had a problem in the past three presidential elections at least, and the polling surprises have sprung from different sources, from different causes each time. So polling is kind of like Tolstoy's Unhappy Families. Polling, when it fails in each in its own way. And Tolstoy wrote about unhappy families. They're unhappy each in their own ways. So, polling's gone through a rough patch. It has some problems, and it's trying to work it out. And the 2020 polling overall, collectively, was the worst in the U.S. presidential election since 1984.
And what about 2022? Because we had this whole narrative of a red wave that Republicans were going to sweep through in the midterms. And, it didn't materialize. Democrats kept the Senate, and the House did narrowly move into the Republican column, but it wasn't the kind of overwhelming victory that Republicans were expecting. Now, I've been reading about what happened that year, and 538, again, I'm bringing them up because they have become such a giant in the polling space, has argued that 2022, in fact, was a big win for polling, that most really well-respected polls had, predicted that Democrats would do as well as they did. But there was this influx of partisan polls that was really weighted in favor of Republican candidates in 2022, and that tended to help the media build this inaccurate narrative. How much do you think polling is an art versus a science?
It's both. It is both art and science, and sometimes it seems more art than science. And I think a good characterization of polling, election polling anyway, is that it is a scientific method to produce an estimate. And pollsters are often very insistent that what they do does not predict outcomes, but give us an estimate of where things are standing. Now, that may be pollsters dodging the inevitability of their work, but I think it's an interesting characterization that polling is a scientific method to reach an estimate. In 2022, though, it was kind of a mixed bag for polling. I'm not as inclined to embrace the fact that, or the notion that polls did extraordinarily well or were historically good in 2022. And there's one great example in Washington State where Patty Murray was up for re-election to the U.S. Senate, and some polls were signaling that her candidacy was in trouble in 2022. And reportedly, according to the New York Times, she was shifting resources away that she would use or send to other campaigns, and she was redirecting them to her own campaign to shore up her prospects of re-election in Washington State. She won by an overwhelming majority, by a landslide, by more than 10 percentage points. But some polls thought that she was really in jeopardy in 2022. So I think that's an example of some of the mixed signals that polling was giving off in that election, the midterm election.
Yeah.
It was also an election, of course, when Donald Trump wasn't on the ballot. And some pollsters think that Trump's presence on the ballot screws things up for polls, and they just can't really figure out how to best get to Trump supporters and get them to participate in polls and to really tap and understand what they're thinking. And I don't know if that's a pollster's excuse or if it's a reality, but when Trump is on the ballot and when Trump is off the ballot, things seem to be a bit different with pollsters. Of course, midterms are not the same as national elections that we have every 4 years with the president.
Ahead of the Democratic National Convention in August, we're going to be seeing a lot more polls, especially in swing states, comparing Harris's chances against Trump. We know that polling has its issues. It is fallible. Any guidance on how people will be looking at the new polling coming out for Harris? Because right now, we largely just have the national averages of her against Trump, which most show a few points behind for Harris against Trump. A couple show her maybe up by 1 or 2 points, but a lot of this is within the margin of error. So as people are kind of digesting the new numbers that will come out with Vice President Harris versus Donald Trump, how should they be approaching this information? How would you recommend people read them?
I recommend that people treat election polling, with a good deal of skepticism, to treat them warily, that they may be wrong, that they could be right, but they're telling us something, but they're not telling us exactly what's going to happen come November, early November. And so I think that even at the Democratic National Convention in August, we're still going to be several weeks away from the election, and a lot can change. Polling can be unpredictable. Polling can be subject to error and misguided indicators. So I think that people would be best served by just not ignoring them completely necessarily, but treating them warily and saying, okay, I see what they're saying, but they're not necessarily all saying the same thing, and they're not necessarily going to be telling us what's going to happen come November. So I don't know, it's hard to do that. I recognize that. It's hard to say, I'll just treat them with some skepticism and leave it at that, because as you mentioned earlier, polling is everywhere, and we're going to be seeing a lot of polls released between now and Election Day, and we'll be overwhelmed with polls in some respects. So collectively, I think it's best to treat them cautiously.
Are there ones that you would say you would more seriously look at? I mean, certain pollsters that you believe are really high quality versus ones that you would eliminate. I mean, it's hard because there is so much of a mountain of information out there. Are there ones that you trust more than others?
Emerson College polling has done a good job in recent elections. I think that they're very earnest, they're very aggressive in terms of embracing new technologies or new methodologies of polling. And their polling record is pretty good. In 2020, they came within a half a percentage point of pegging Joe Biden's margin of victory over Donald Trump. And that was pretty good. And not many pollsters were even in the neighborhood of getting it close to right. So Emerson College polling is certainly one that's on my radar as a top-notch pollster. A lot of the media polling, I'm thinking New York Times, Siena College, CNN's polls, they get a lot of attention given that they are supported by or commissioned by major news outlets. So they inevitably get a lot of attention. I do know that CNN has had a uneven track record in recent presidential elections, and they're really trying hard. They've adopted new techniques this time to try to get it right, to get closer. In 2020, CNN was 12 percentage points ahead, said Biden was 12 percentage points ahead, and that was a big miss for them. So since then, they've gone away from exclusively phone-based polling to a bit of a melange of polling methodologies, and we'll see how that works this year. So for good and bad, there are different polling organizations that do, I think, deserve attention.
W. Joseph Campbell is Professor Emeritus of Communications at American University and the author of Lost in a Gallup, Polling Failures in U.S. Presidential Elections. And there's been a few. Professor, thanks so much again for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to Soundside. This show is only possible because listeners support us. If you're able to give right now, please check out the show notes for a link to donate. And don't forget, you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 FM Seattle at noon and 8 p.m., Monday through Thursday, or anytime online at KUOW.org.